And we do want to bring in Jon Meacham. He's an historian and the author of an upcoming book about Lewis called His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. John, good morning. Thank you so much for being here on such an important Saturday morning. Help us remember and think about the legacy of John Lewis. He was thought of as the conscience of Congress. What have we all lost this morning, John?
We've lost a huge part of the American story, one of the best parts of the human story. Lewis is a transcendent figure, and I'm going to use the present tense because he continues even to this hour, and if we do the right thing, he will continue going forward to inspire and illuminate. He was a genuine saint, and that doesn't make him some alabaster figure or stained glass figure. He was a human being who was willing to suffer and to die for his understanding of the gospel and how that gospel found expression in the United States of America of the 20th and 21st centuries. He was about the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. He understood that at its best, the human drama and the American drama is about reversal. It's about being kind when the human instinct might be to be cruel. It's about being generous when the human instinct might be to be greedy. And what he led the country with innumerable others, he'd be the first person to say that, he led the country to a fuller recognition, if not a final reckoning, of our most serious national sins. And there was an early Christian thinker who said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And John Lewis's blood and his courage and his convictions should be the seed of a better America.
John, let's talk about the role that Congressman Lewis played in the civil rights movement, the youngest speaker at the March on Washington that he helped organize, just 23 years old at the time. He recently recounted that he has spent basically the entirety of his life in some form or another fighting for freedom and for equality. How influential, how instrumental was he in that fight for freedom?
Well, in many ways, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, immensely important. John Lewis was a kind of, to use a military metaphor about a nonviolent movement, he was the field commander. He was the soldier walking point. He was at the front of that line in Selma. He was on the Freedom Rides. He was in Rock Hill, South Carolina, beaten by a Klansman who years later, after President Obama won, said, I'm horrified I did that. I'm sorry. And he and John Lewis became friends because Lewis lived out the convictions in his heart. Love as an ideal was not as significant to him as love as a reality. And this all may sound kind of high-flown and as if we're in a kind of emotional moment about this death. I know this as well as I know anything. You cannot be sentimental about this man because he was prideful, he could lose his temper. But at every point, from his birth in Pike County, Alabama, his great-grandfather was a slave, so to him, slavery wasn't an abstraction, to reading about the Brown versus Board of Education decision in his grandfather's newspaper because his family couldn't afford a subscription, to reading about Emmett Till, the lynching of Emmett Till, and realizing that could have been me. They were the same age. To going to see Dr. King when he was 18 years old and wanted to integrate voices. On and on and on. He lived out a reality. And this story is much more important than just civil rights. This is about the American character, and it's about the Christian story overall.
And John, I love that you talk about him in the present tense because in his final days, he was still fighting for equality, for justice. He did a town hall with former President Barack Obama, spoke to the next generation. He was so optimistic as he looked out at these protests all across the country, which were in some ways a continuation of that movement as he saw it. You've known him, you've been chronicling him. What is a memory that stands out in your mind on this day when we remember him?
I think in these last months, the fact that he would be on the phone because of the virus and his own illness, and would talk about how he wept when he saw the video of the killing of George Floyd. And you realized here is a figure who bridges, if you will, these eras that we might want to think, or at least people who look like me want to think, are very different. But there is a through line, and it's through John Lewis's life, from slavery, segregation, systemic racism, the issues we're confronting today. And one of the figures who links that together and who wanted us to rise above that by drawing on religious impulses. He was in the streets of America, not because of Gandhi, but because of Jesus of Nazareth. He will tell you that he will tell you that. That was the drama for him. And to me, and you all know this, you were around him, you were around him and you realized you were in the presence of a kind of otherworldliness.
For sure.
That was, you'd walk through the Capitol with him, you'd be on that bridge with him, and you would be lifted up simply by his charisma. And charisma, means gift of the gods. That's the root of the word. And so it wasn't charm exactly, though he was funny and charming, but it was this powerful ambient witness to how do we actually put into action the greatest commandment any of us have ever been given, from whatever tradition, right, or no tradition, to love one another as ourselves.
Yeah, being in his presence, it was clear you were in the presence of a giant. Jon Meacham, thank you so much for lending your perspective this morning. Once again, Jon's upcoming book about Lewis is called His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope.